So we only have one Mac product, Joyce. So it's ACDSee Photo Studio for Mac 7 in this case. And then we have 3 PC products, which are separated into sort of tiers, Home, Pro, and Ultimate, all of which, both the Mac and the Ultimate ones, apply in this case for the coupon. Okay, so I took a photo about a year ago that's a really good example of a bad photo, one that we can clean up. It's not, the composition in and of itself isn't a bad image, it just needs work. And that's the perfect subject for our discussion today on how our raw mode works. So what I've done is I've just got 2 raw images. This was taken with a Sony camera. And we're going to go through the process of fixing this image, but also explaining how the raw processing works. Because there's some stuff that goes on in the background that's kind of interesting. And one of the things that's very interesting about developing a raw image in ACDSee is it creates a sort of its own method to present to you those changes. And so in the middle of this workshop, we're going to talk about XMP files and how to basically utilize them. No, Catherine, we're not going to talk about noise reduction today. However, we have done a workshop on that in the past, and I'll link that. That's actually a good thing to link right now before we get too far into it. So we have a workshop section here on our YouTube channel, which is, I believe, YouTube ACDSee Photo Studio. There we go. Oops. But it's this here. YouTube.com/ACDSee Photo Studio. And then we did a workshop on basically noise reduction and also restoring an older photograph, which there's lots to learn from. Okay, cool. Anyway, without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so I just wanted to make, I'm in manage mode here. I have my film strip, and it's showing me in this case the 2 raw images. I made a copy of my original one because at the end of this, I'd like to actually make a comparison between my original file and the one that we're going to be editing today. And so I'm going to take this first image here and I'm going to bring it into develop mode. So in ACDSee, we have essentially these 5 different modes, but the 3 main modes are manage, develop, and edit mode. And in this case, manage mode is obviously for navigating to your files, categorizing your files, that sort of thing. And then I often will get the question, well, what's the main differences between develop mode and edit mode? And the difference between those 2 modes are basically develop mode is your central hub for editing raw files. It can edit other files too, like PNGs and JPEGs and TIFFs and that sort of thing, but it is principally useful for editing a raw file because it parametrically edits the file, which means that it's totally non-destructive and sort of saves each incremental change that you make to the file. And then the edit mode, which we won't be going into today, but I cover in great depth in a couple previous workshops. Edit mode is a very versatile mode. It can be non-destructive, but it's principally used to make composition images with layers. And I would check out that YouTube channel I just linked for our workshops on edit mode. So I'm going to take this raw file here. I'm going to open it into develop mode here, and we're going to make some alterations to this file, and then we're going to talk about these XMP profiles that I'm mentioning. We're going to talk about how ACDSee processes a raw image. So first up, there's some pretty glaring geometry issues with this image. So like I said, I took this about a year ago. I'm not like a photographer myself, or not a good photographer, let's put it that way. I am a hobbyist at best. And for me, the very obvious issue here is that this image isn't straight, right? So we're gonna have to go through the process of straightening this image. And when we take this image into develop mode, and we go about making visual changes to our images, I like to, this could change for your own workflow, but I prefer to deal with all of the geometry and repair changes before we actually adjust the light. And this doesn't have to be your workflow. And the reason why it doesn't have to be your workflow is because all of these changes are being altered, like all of the adjustments that we're going to be making to this image. ACDSee as a program applies them all at the same time. So a lot of people will ask, well, like, what's the correct order to make my adjustments in develop mode in? And the answer to that is there is no correct order. You can do it in any order. And the reason why I'm telling you my preference to editing the geometry first is because I'm actually going to be, first of all, straightening this image, and then I'm going to be cropping this image. And I'd rather just edit what I see rather than edit what I have now and then go through the process of cropping it after. So that's my preference, but it doesn't actually matter. And I'll show you why. So in the develop tools, which are in the top left-hand corner here, that's pretty much entirely what we're going to be interacting with. We're not going to really interact with the histogram that much or the development presets or the snapshots today. We're just going to be using the tools itself. But I'm going to open up this image, and instead of working in the Tune tab, which we're going to come back to, I'm actually going to flip to the Geometry tab. And you'll notice that in develop mode, there are 4 tabs here, which contain different tools. So the most tools are in Tune. They sort of relate to the color and light of the image. The second one is detail, which relates to sharpening and noise reduction. There's also a skin tune and chromatic aberration adjustments. And then the third tool is geometry, which we're going to be opening. And then we also have a repair tool for cloning out certain elements. And so we're going to go through the process of adjusting this geometry. And the first thing I'm going to start with, I'm not going to play around too much with lens correction. You can. All lens correction does, in this case, I'm using a Sony Alpha 7. All it does it makes a slight adjustment to the curvature of the, in this case, the lens. So all of these lens profiles can be manually corrected, but ACDSee does a fairly good job of going in and making lens profiles for current cameras. If your camera isn't listed here, chances are we're going to get to it in a couple months. We release new camera lens profiles and RAW support basically 2 to 3 times a year. And that when that happens is when we release a new product, and then there's we release a new update sort of centrally through the year, and maybe a third one if we have time. But anyway, so lens correction, I'm not going to play around with too much. I actually like that sort of slight curvature to this image. However, you can certainly correct it with that. What we actually want to be interacting with more is this rotate and straighten tool, which is second on the panel here. Why don't I close the perspective and crop just for a second so I can show you what this looks like. So you can manually straighten your image, obviously by rotating it like this. And as you can see, what happens when we rotate our image is there's this cropped section that appears around the edge of our image. This is in essence what we're going to be removing when we go to make the tune adjustments. That's a pretty bad job, Adam, because it's even more rotated than it was before. So I can just reset that by clicking on that little cogwheel here. What I find is useful, especially for horizons, is using this line straightening tool, which is in the corner of the UI here. It has just this line straight through it. And what you can do is you can actually take your background here and you can illustrate what the horizon looks like in your image, like I can right there. And then it'll essentially auto-correct based on that line structure. And so in this case, it rotated it correctly. We now have a nice straight water line here. And as you can see, around the edge are the areas that we're going to be cropping out. But if I navigate away from geometry to tune, it'll sort of set that in motion, and then we'll get a finalized version of that geometry structure. But what's really important to note is if I go back to geometry, because this is a parametric non-destructive edit, this information is withheld. So I can adjust this as I see fit in the future. That adjustment to the geometry is always going to be non-destructive, and it's always going to be editable in the future. what I'll do just to sort of further showcase that feature is I'm actually going to navigate back to manage mode. So away from this image, away from develop mode. So I'm just going to click done down in the bottom, just on the left here underneath the development tools. And I'm going to save this image. So saving this image essentially places those development changes. And there's going to be a difference that you'll notice between these two images now in manage mode. We're no longer in develop mode, we're in manage mode. And what you're going to see is that there's this little development icon that appears on the bottom left-hand corner. Now, what that development icon indicates to us is that you have developed this image. There's some development changes. And as we know by visually looking at our image, we're looking at a preview of the raw file here. We can see that this image is straight, whereas our original still has that curve. It's pretty wild how bad that is. But yeah, we definitely have the change here. So all that is to say is when we see that little development icon on the bottom left-hand corner, we know that we have made a development change to our image. One of the cool things about this too is a lot of people don't know this necessarily. There's a couple ways to essentially reset these values to return this image back to its original state. And for all intents and purposes, I'm not actually impacting the original raw file. I'm going to take a moment to express this now because it's very important. When we're making developments to our image, our raw image, okay, what we're doing is in ACDSee, it creates something called an XMP profile. I can show you where this lives. It's actually really interesting. So just keep in mind, all we've made to this image is we've made a geometry adjustment. We've straightened our image, okay? But that information, that the degree to which we've straightened this image is saved, okay? I'm gonna open up a file explorer, okay? And what we're gonna do is we're gonna navigate to the exact location of this file where it exists on our hard drive. The difference is I'm not previewing in an ACDSee now, I'm just looking for that image. So I'm going to go to my pictures folder. I'll go to my compositions folder. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the one that's called March 28th. It's somewhere in here. Workshop. And then it is a March 30th. There we go. Sorry, 30th, not 28th. Okay, so let's compare these two. Oops. I'm going to compare these two folders, basically the folder structure that we see on the bottom left-hand corner there, and then the folder we see in our folder hierarchy via Windows. So in ACDSee, what we see is we see this original file that we wanted to essentially use to reference, and then we see our adjusted image, the image that has the development changes in it. So when we look for these same images within our folder structure, like this, you can see that our original is here. Okay, so that corresponds with this image right here. That's our, our original that we're using to preview. And then we have this file here, which is the file that we're actually editing, the DSC07637 raw image. We see that it's raw because it's a .arw file. And then alongside it is this XMP file, okay, which contains the edits. So this raw file, okay, if I was to say copy and paste it, we can see a copied image that popped up in our folder here. But you'll notice that those adjustments haven't been applied to this image. You'll see that that image is no longer straight again. We're looking at our original image again. And the reason why this is because this copy that we created is the original raw file. Raw files, you can't make saves, adjustments, developments, edits, right, to a raw file. That's the case for all editors, whether it be photo like Lightroom or something like that, or you're using Capture One, it doesn't matter. You cannot edit a raw file. So what ACDSee and other editors do is they create this profile that contains the edits. So when you're using ACDSee, you're actually referencing this file. So we have our edited image here, which is our raw file, and then our XMP profile that comes alongside with that image, which contains all the edits that we've actually made in ACDSee. And you know it's an ACDSee file because we got the way old ACDSee logo on it, which probably hasn't changed since like ACDSee 3. So all this is to say is raw files are they're not an editable file type. So this sort of secondary sidecar file needs to be created. Now, where this isn't the case, so I'm going to go back to manage mode and I'll navigate to a different folder. We're just going to snag a JPEG this time. JPEGs are kind of interesting because they interact really differently. I'll just grab the dog, this dog here, and I'll navigate back to my pictures folder, that compositions one that we had earlier, and I'll just find it here, and I'll add this dog image to our folder. So this is a JPEG, and we know it's a JPEG because there's a little icon in the top right-hand corner of our manage mode that says the file type, and it's right next to our raw image that has adjustments in it. So, and let's rename this image. I'll just name it dog. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make an adjustment in develop mode to this dog image. So I'll take this image, go into develop mode, and let's make the exact same adjustment. I'll go into geometry and let's straighten our image. And in this case, I will not straighten it. I'll actually mess it all up. But the point is that I'm making a change to my image. I will save my image. And now I get a nice little icon in the bottom left-hand corner of my JPEG here of my dog, indicating to me that this image has been developed. It's been adjusted. Now the difference is going to be that because a JPEG is a writable file, meaning that ACDSee can write directly into the file. It can tell the file the exact degree by which we rotated our image. That this image will not have an XMP profile. It won't have this sidecar file that lives in that same folder. And I can show you that right now. And I'm going to struggle to find that same file because they all look the same. March 30th. So as you can see, my dog image here lives in here with the other raw images. And we have our original, we have our copy that we created of this image right here. And then we have the actual, this image with its corresponding sidecar file, which lives right here. But then we have this JPEG in here. And as you can see in the thumbnail, it illustrates to us that those changes are made. And all we need to take away from this is that raw files are never going to be, in this case, that original raw file is never going to be destroyed in any way. Whenever you're making adjustments in ACDSee, we're just adding this little secondary file. Now, the interesting thing about JPEGs and the way that this also is non-destructive for JPEGs is that because you can save edits to JPEGs, the information is just stored within it. So I can go down to this image here, I can go to process, I can go to restore to original, and we're back to our original JPEG in the same way that we interacted with our raw file in that same way. The point is that I'm not just adding that information to the file. I'm creating this secondary file. So what's kind of interesting about this as well is by default, ACDSee moves that information when I move this file. So let's get rid of our dog. Let's get rid of our copy. We don't need these files. We'll copy our developed raw image, okay? So if I copy this file, okay, and I move to a different folder, I'm just gonna create a dummy folder here. So in manage mode, I'm gonna navigate to manage mode. I'm navigating one folder up in the hierarchy, and then I'm just gonna create a new folder. I'll just call it one test folder. And what I'll do is I'm just going to navigate to this test folder, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that image, that raw file, to this folder. And so in this folder, we have the raw image, and then we also have the XMP profile, and we have this developed folder. So if we reference our original folder, that looks exactly the same. Let me see here, compositions. We'll go back down to this March 30th folder. And you can see that we have our original image here. We have our XMP profile, and we have this developed folder. And all this developed folder contains is a JPEG that acts as the thumbnail, the developed thumbnail. And actually, this folder, by default in ACDSee, or in your default of ACDSee, won't be viewable. I just am showing a hidden folder so that we can understand these concepts. So, which means to say, and this the important element of this, is when you go to move or copy and paste your raw files that have been developed using ACDSee, you're moving those XMP profiles with it, right? I can take this image and I can move it into a different folder. This one right here, I can move it into dual exposure, for example. And then that raw file is now moved into a different folder using ACDSee. And then when we navigate to that folder, which is the dual exposure one, which will be right here, we can see that that raw file has been moved along with the development changes. So, okay, Adam, that's a lot of information about XMP profiles. What's the takeaway? So the takeaway is move your developed raw images in ACDSee because that XMP profile is moved along with it. So whenever we're interacting with our raw files and we've made developments to it, just use ACDSee for it. Or, okay, or if we're using the Finder, right? So if we go back up to our pictures folder and we find that same original March 30th folder, or when we're moving, just note that what we want to do is we want to actually move these two files alongside each other. So my recommendation is, because now we know that ACDSee has to create this XMP file, is to just move those files if you need to move them around using edit mode, using manage mode in ACDSee. But if you're moving these files separately of ACDSee, you're like, oh, I'm working with my hard drives, I just need to move some certain things around. You're going to navigate to those folders and you're going to notice these XMP profiles, and you're probably going to wonder what they are. You're going to go, well, I don't need this. Doesn't seem like it's necessary. It is, because ACDSee references these files when we make changes in develop mode. And they're tiny, like they're not big files. They just contain literal numbers, right? So I'm going to take these two files together and I'm going to copy them using Finder, right? And all I'm going to do is now I'm just going to create another folder in the topmost hierarchy here. And I'm just going to call it here, I'll call it to test folder. And then when I open this test folder and I place those two images, if I navigate to that using ACDSee this time, so if I navigate away to my pictures and I find that to test folder, which is right here, there's my edited raw image. And if I go into those development changes, we can see very clearly that that geometry change is flagged. It's right here. You can see that there's this little indicator telling us that we've made a geometry change and that we're holding this information. So that non-destructive information is held within the XMP profile and it's being moved in ACDSee automatically. Or if you're using folder or Finder rather, you're just making sure to copy those two elements because they contain information that you need. So that's how develop mode interacts with the sort of the content that we're creating. And the takeaway is, because we're using raw files, the main folder or the main file type that you're really going to want to interact with in develop mode. And that isn't to say that you can't edit a JPEG or a PNG or a TIFF in develop mode, but those files are writable. And what ACDSee does is it writes that information, the changes in quotation marks, the developments, to that file directly, versus raw files. It's written to the XMP profile. So, and a little aside about that, because you might be like, well, why the distinction? Why are raw files not editable? So you have a camera. So say you have a Canon camera or a, like that camera has its own file that company creates. So Canon has a specific raw file that it designs, okay, for its digital camera. And that digital camera raw file that it creates for that model, that etc., that make of its camera, is proprietary information that the camera company, in this case, that Canon in our example, doesn't give out. So they don't give that information to companies like ACDSee. They don't give that information to companies like, a Photoshop or Adobe or something like that. So when we create software that edits raw files, we need to create a workaround. And that workaround in this case is to open a raw file and then create this XMP profile that provides information that you're looking at when you're interacting with ACDSee, which is different from a JPEG or a PNG or a TIFF, which are non-proprietary files. They're files that are completely open source and are creatable in most softwares. Okay, before we go into making more edits, I'm going to have a look at some of the questions here because I wanted to sort of get that all out before I had a look. Let's see here. What if you move a raw file and delete the XMP file? Can you still open it? Yeah, you can open that raw file. Absolutely. It's just when you open it at ACDSee, it's gonna be in its original state, right, Meng? So because there's no longer an XMP profile to reference. So if you move in Finder, in this case we have our test folder here. Okay, let's get out of this image just so I don't break something. I'll move back to manage mode. I'll even navigate away from this folder. What I'm going to do is I have this test folder here, and I'm actually going to delete this XMP profile. And now my understanding is that when I open this up in ACDSee, I'm going to be seeing, I believe, if I refresh this, my original image without the XMP profile changes. Actually, no, it holds it. I don't know why that would be the case, but it might be due to some caching issue, but it appears that though I can delete that XMP profile and still see that. This is something I wouldn't get into the habit of doing just because I'm not certain about this. Okay, let me see here. It was that test folder. I'm going to go back up. Yeah, there's probably something I'm misunderstanding about that. But I wouldn't get into the habit of doing that because I think it might screw up things. I would do if I am going to be moving files in the folder, not ACDSee, just try to get in the habit of moving it with the XMP profile. Peter asked, when you use develop mode to modify a JPEG file, does it alter the original JPEG when you finish? So in the same way that we talked about this XMP profile, right, and how it is, you can still at any point return that original JPEG in ACDSee to its original appearance. The reason why I specified this XMP profile is because I can't write directly to that raw file. However, when we're interacting with just a regular old JPEG, JPEGs leave space within the metadata of the file for that information to be essentially written to the file. So when you modify that JPEG, it still can be reverted back to its original changes. You can still open up those development changes in ACDSee and tweak them, that sort of thing. It's just the difference is that JPEG is a writable file, and that information doesn't need to be sorted into an XMP file for you to see those adjustments. The JPEG in itself is capable of containing any an additional written information in the file. Gary asked, what if you're working on a file that has a sidecar file from a different editor, such as DxO Photolab? How does the other sidecar file come into lay with an ACDSee? My understanding is that the two proprietary files, in this case, between ACDSee and another photo editor, the DxO, the adjustments, they're probably not going to be compatible. Unless I'm misunderstanding, but I'm fairly certain that those adjustments, like the way that the adjustments to the file are coded into that XMP profile, the way that information is coded is not necessarily something that ACDSee can read, provided that code was, say, something that was made open source by DxO. Because then our developers could go in and they go, oh, okay, that's how they're coding that information when they make changes. here's the way that we can interpret those changes using our own software. Because in DxO, maybe they have a specific tool, like they have their own proprietary light editing tool. And how does ACDSee translate that information if it doesn't have that same tool? So ultimately, no, those XMP profiles, they largely don't interact with each other. If they do, it might be at the very least some very, very general change, but I would say that that's probably not the case for 99% of those interactions. Ivor asked, if you revert an edited JPEG to its original form, are you losing quality through saving, editing, and resaving? No, you're not. It's reverted to its original changes, and there's if there's loss occurring with the JPEG, it's going to be on a hyper marginal level. I mean, JPEGs are lossy file types in the same way that like PNGs and TIFFs and all of these things that are editable files are lossy, but you're not going to notice anything, Ivor. Like you won't. It's not going to be a distinguishable change ever. I mean, we can even go through the process of making some development changes to a JPEG image and then reverting it and seeing how much the file size actually changes. You're just not going to see it. You'd have to like edit it over and 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 over again to see any degree of loss. So Martin asked, what is saved in the original folder? That's a good question. Let me navigate back to my original composition folder. March 30th here. Yeah, I think the originals folder is just a history of this image. And as you can see, this image, this folder here is actually grayed out. So it's not going to be visible in ACDSee, and it shouldn't be visible in Finder. The reason why it is visible, or how you would be able to see these developed original folders, is by going to View, Options, and then once again going to View and Options, and you'll see that I have in my version of Windows, I have hidden files and folders shown, versus by default they will be don't show hidden files, folders, or drives. Again, I wanted to pop those up so you can see what's going on in the back end with the development process here. By default, yours is going to look like this. There'll be your file and your XMP file and any other files that are in your folder. So the original folder, I believe, contains history, is the answer to your question. Let's have a look at some of these other questions here. Jillian, what is the original folder? And okay, we talked about that. Is there such a thing as a standard sidecar file? If not, is there conversion software to convert to from other vendor softwares? So we talked about that a little bit about that. I mean, the sidecar file itself, there will be a lot of XMP, like that is a common sidecar file, but they're not, it doesn't necessarily mean that it'll translate to being able to make adjustments in other editors. Oh, actually, Franz added an interesting element to this. If you delete the original folder, you cannot restore to the original, as far as I know. Again, this shouldn't be the case, like 99% of interactions, because those folders that you saw there are not visible to you unless you turn those on. So it basically holds the information of the history of the image with the original image being stored in that folder. Ultimately, probably don't delete those if you have those turned on, is the long story short to that. And so what is the develop folder that we can see in File Explorer? So it literally just contains the thumbnail of the developed image so that ACDSee can preview that to you, but it is not visible to you unless you have those hidden files shown, as with the original folder we were just talking about. David asks, sorry, can you briefly repeat the XMP takeaway? Okay, so the XMP takeaway is this. When you edit or rather when you develop a raw image in ACDSee, because ACDSee can't write directly to a raw image, not in the same sense like a JPEG or a TIFF or a PNG file, right? Those are writable files. So because ACDSee can't write directly to the raw file, nor can any other editor, it creates this folder that ACDSee uses to reference when presenting to you your developments. So that XMP file contains the adjustments. That's why it pops up in your folder structure. And then as a side note, just for ease of use, get used to if you have developed raw images, just move them around in ACDSee, or note that when you're moving them in your folder structure to just make sure that you always supply the XMP profile in addition to the file when you're moving it around. That's my takeaway. David asked, does this mean that one should utilize the manufacturer's photo editing tools first to work with a proprietary format? Does their stuff have some advantage over yours? Manufacturer's photo editing tools. Oh, in the case of the actual camera model, yeah, you can certainly play around with that first before editing in ACDSee. I can't think of any particular advantage to maybe doing that over unless they have some like tools or certain things that ACDSee doesn't have, then maybe you'd want to get the benefit of that. But yeah. Rick asked, will ACDSee work with DNG files? I've had problems in the past where it locks up. That's a good question. You probably want to email me about that. I think some DNG files are not a problem and others are. But please email me and I'll get into it with our QA team. Anonymous asked, how do you deal with the blurred foreground material in a photo are you editing? Can ACDSee correct a blurred segment of a photo? You can correct a blurred segment of a photo. That's a complicated adjustment. You can do so by sharpening your image, but I would open it in edit mode and use sharper portions of your image to adjust that. That's more of a layered editing change. You also might use take one part of your image in focus and take another part of your image out of focus. So you have multiple ranges of focus and then combine them. Yeah. Okay, let's move on. I'll answer some more raw questions afterwards. I'm just going to go to my original folder here, compositions, and we're just going to talk about how to make, in this case, now that we've talked about and understood the actual process involved with those XMP profiles, let's actually make some development adjustments to this image because it needs them. Okay, so we looked at geometry. That was our very first adjustment, indicated by this little blue icon to the left of it, noting that we have adjusted it. And all we did was draw a line through it, and it's saved that information. I'm also going to crop this image. So I actually want our gentleman, the couple here sitting on the bench, to be on the thirds line. So what I'm going to do is I will put them on the thirds line by cropping our image slightly. I'll probably do that, maybe a little bit on the right as well. And I'll just move them right in there by using the crop tool. Now, when we're interacting with rotate or straighten, and we just click on these little bounding boxes on the edge, that'll pop up the actual crop tool itself and will indicate to us the amount that we can crop either manually or we can go in and enter these values ourselves. But I'm just going to go in and I'm going to set it right there. And then I'm going to navigate, I'm going to navigate away from geometry to make that adjustment. So we're going to actually navigate to repair because this image looks pretty good. There's nothing that we would really stands out as things we want to remove, but I will showcase the repair function because it's actually very similar to geometry in that sense. So under the repair tool, you can see that we have red eye reduction. Well, we'll just close that. We don't need it. There's no eyes in here to repair. But we have the repair function here. And if we want to get rid of something, perhaps what we would actually want to get rid of is just maybe some, seaweed or something like that in the foreground here. We can use a couple different methods, and I think heal is actually going to be a good method here because there's very little granular detail. It's kind of like a blurry, like shore area here. And I think heal would work better than something like clone, which would take the literal area and repeat it. That's probably not what we want. And blended clone, while good, is still going to, we're still going to run into some issues, where it's getting a bit choppy. It's not doing a good job. And that just comes from the fact that it's not healing in the same way. It's not blending these elements as good as just using the heal tool in of itself. So I will take the heal tool by clicking on the little modal option right here. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on a portion of my image, and I'm just going to cover over that gently, and then it'll do a fairly good job of just blending that in. I might just work on that a couple times. Maybe I'll go undo, undo. I kind of don't want it to be that aggressive. Yeah, that's better. I just want to still see a little bit of that on the left there. To undo, and it looks like repair actually does a fairly good job of undoing individual repair adjustments, which is cool. I didn't actually know that. I just tried it out. But undo is in the history panel just on the bottom right here. And I can undo or redo any adjustments that I have. Okay, I'm going to zoom out. We got rid of our little sea gunk there. That's good. Let's go back to the tune panel and let's talk about adjusting some of the colors in our image here. I talked about this quite a bit in our previous workshop, but we're actually going to adjust the curve on this. And something I've been enjoying and getting a lot out of is slightly making the blacks, pulling them slightly into the shadows to get a little, to add or to sort of bring out more detail and to remove contrast. Because we can actually gain contrast by using light EQ, which we'll talk about in a bit here as well. In tune, you'll notice that there's a ton of adjustments. So we have general, white balance, light EQ, color wheel, tone wheels, tone curves, etc. And I'm probably only going to use a couple of these. I just have them all closed so I can just look at tone curves here. So tone curves works very similar to any other curves in the sense that I can pull these values up. I can take all of our blacks and pull them into whites. I can take all of my colored areas here and darken them. In this case, it looks like I got the blue. All I'm going to do is slightly pull up that line, and then I'm going to curve that line into this center yellow midtone section here. And all this is going to do is take those really dark areas and make them a bit grayer. And then what I'm going to do is I'm possibly going to pull our midtones line, which is this yellow line here. I'm just going to pull it slightly to the right. And we're going to adjust some of these blacks in light EQ here. So I'll go into the light EQ function, which is up at the top, and we can close tone curves for now. We'll come back to it. In the tone, or the method I'm going to be using is actually the advanced method for this. So there's 3 methods of light EQ. There's basic, which has 3 bars, shadows, midtones, and highlights. There's standard, which actually by default has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bands of brightening, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bands of darkening. Advanced takes the concept of standard, which you have these 5 different bands that interact with different portions of light, right? In this case, these are considered highlights, or these are considered whites, these are considered blacks, or these are considered shadows, and these are considered midtones. Well, it takes these sort of curve bars here, and instead of there being 5 of them, it actually makes 100 of them. So it increases that by a whole bunch. And so when we pull these lines, each of these sort of sections here are an individual spectrum of either shadows, blacks, whites, midtones, and highlights. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take this top section here, and we're going to make these this curve here, which is this top section, which are our brights again, right? These are all of our highlights, brightening. And we're going to adjust those, and then we're going to adjust our darks separately. Oh, I have the amplitude way turned down. So with this section here, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take this middle line here, and I'm just going to right click and pull upwards. The area that I want to make brighter is this section right here next to this rock face here. So I'm just going to pull this upwards. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to darken the sky in our image here. So I want to darken the highlights where I've made the midtones brighter, right? The difference between this midtone section here and then our original is pretty substantive. What I'm going to do is I'm going to darken this bottom portion by right-clicking now, not left-clicking, and I'm going to find an area I like. And I'm just going to pull out on the very, very far right to darken this section of our image, which is our foreground here versus our background here. So, which is kind of giving it a bit of an HDR vibe. We're going to come in and we're going to soften this because that's a bit aggressive. And we might turn this down slightly. And I'm just going to find a home where I think this fits the best. I really like the appearance of this, and I like that our clouds are popping through quite a bit here. So I have an amplitude. That amplitude's a bit high. I want to go down. Maybe let's go to about 18. And then I think our amplitude is a bit too high here. I like the space that it's in, but I want to maybe reduce it to about 46. So right here, all we've done is we've taken these midtones and we've just popped them up. We just pulled those midtones, a little bit of the highlights in here, we just pulled them up, and that's really apparent in the center of our image, right? Which was far too gray before in our original. And we're getting a lot of detail and contrast on these rocks here. What we've also done is we've taken the sort of the parts of our image that are our highlights, this range right here, our highlights being further to the right here. And what we've done is we've added a bit of darkening to that section, and that's apparent, most apparent right in these clouds here, which is giving our clouds some beautiful contrast from the sky here. And pardon me, really making them pop, especially where we see in and above these whites here. What we've also done, and it's barely visible, but on the very, very left-hand side of this darkening section over here on the Light EQ panel, what I've done is I've pulled that area down, and all that does is darken our foreground here, which is the part of our image that is already most dark. So I took that and I just bolstered it a little bit. Now we can verify in our image here that we haven't blown out any part of our image, either overexposed or underexposed it, by clicking on the Show Clipped button. And the Show Clipped button, if we had made a really egregious change, it'll illustrate to us areas of our image that we've clipped. In this case, they have entered the range of areas that are now overexposed or potentially underexposed. So underexposed are indicated by these this green area here, and then overexposed is indicated by this red area here. And what you'll notice is if we look at the Light EQ panel, this actually corresponds really nicely with our waveform here. So this waveform represents the dark parts of our image on the bottom here and the light parts of our image on the top here. When the amplitude enters that range, right, that's when we start to see that part of our image become too bright. And I can just turn off this clip shadows to illustrate that is, in this case, way, 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 way too bright. I'm going to go back a couple steps so I can see what it looked like before. There we go. So when we pull one of these, when we pull our lightning curve into the areas of our image that are already bright, it overexposes them. And when we pull our darkening band into the areas of our image that are already dark, it underexposes them, which results in a clipped image. That's all you need to know there. I like these changes. Again, we'll compare it to our original, which was quite gray, to our new one. There's lots more adjustments that we need to make for this, but I really like how that brings out the foreground in our image, or sorry, rather the center point of our image here, I guess our focus. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the color wheel, and we're going to make an adjustment of the blue in our image. So I'm going to select that blue, and what you'll notice is when I select that blue, it'll navigate over to that blue using the wheel. So I have it set to red right now. If I was to just click on the blue, it'll move that section over here. And then what we can do is we can adjust the values that are listed underneath here now that we've made a selection of that blue. So we can look at saturation, hue, brightness, contrast, etc. So we'll leave the smoothness as is. We might up the saturation slightly. I kind of want this to have a bit more of a green appearance to it. We'll see. We can change the hue. I could pull it into the cyan range, maybe like there. And I can just lower the brightness a bit. And I can maybe increase the contrast slightly. See what happens. That really impacts the edge of our image right here on the waterline. So we have a bit more of an cyan approach to that now than before, which was almost quite gray. That's actually a bit egregious now that I look at the contrast. I'm going to remove that. And I might reduce the saturation slightly. I just want a gentle increase of that. We've definitely changed the color of the sky. That's good though. Lastly, color-wise, I might go into white balance and just adjust the temperature slider a little bit upwards on adding a bit more yellow, moving our colors further away from blue. I'm going to increase it by about 18 there. All white balance does, it's our second option here. To open it up, you can, if your image is too yellow, you can make it more cyan by adjusting that slider. If our image is very blue, in the case of our image right here, we can increase the yellow and it'll sort of shift the pitch of our image overwards. Vice versa, if your image has a tint that is very magenta, you can slide that further into the green and that'll just sort of even out your image overall. What else do we want to do? I think we did the tone curves. Let's have another look at the tone curves. I'm just going to pull this down slightly. Well, so Hans asked, in Light EQ, you lighten and darken the same areas. Doesn't this cancel the effect by opposite processing? In this case, what I'm trying to do is get as much detail out of our image by sort of adjusting the contrast in those sections. And so I don't think in this case, I don't think it cancels them out, because in many ways we're working with different spectrums of light in our image. In the example with the Light EQ, right, we're looking at the sort of midtones for the lightening curve, and we're looking at the highlights for the darkening curve. So I'm sort of just specifying sort of very broad ranges, but very specific ranges of light, and I'm sort of either adding light to those areas or removing light to them. In regards to the curves change, so when I'm adding this curves change, all I'm doing here is I'm just trying to pull as many of our colors out of the spectrum of a true black as possible and getting them to live in like the shadows area here. You could argue that some images probably want a true black, but I think in this image, it actually is a distracting factor, especially in and around these areas right here, or rocks in the waterline. So I'm trying to pull those values more into the shadows, really dark shadows range. So I guess the long answer to your question is there is probably lots of instances, when you're interacting with Light EQ and you're adding light to, say, like certain parts of your highlights, and maybe you're also darkening certain parts of your highlights. And, when we look at the Light EQ, there is a bit of crossover here. This one is definitely a bit further to the left, meaning it's interacting more with the midtones, and this one's interacting more with the highlights here. So there's going to be a little bit of play there. But I think in this case, they're not canceling each other at all, and actually they're really complementing the image. So just having a quick look at tone curves. And then I think the last thing I want to do to this image before I finalize it is actually add a gradient, which is in itself its whole new effect. So, oh, actually, no, there might be 2 more changes now that I think about it. But for me to say really have comfortable with this development, I'm going to go into the effect panel and I'm going to add a gradient map to our image. So the effect panel essentially layers something over top of the image. It's the closest to layering that development does, similar to edit mode. But the nice thing about effects specifically is it allows you to reduce the opacity and to adjust the blend mode. And in this case, we definitely plan to do that. We don't want a gradient map that is this egregious. That's way too much. So I'm going to click on my color here. When I click on the color itself, it opens up the color picker. And when I click on the arrow here, it'll open up this little small color picker that's in this section here. I'm just going to click on the color itself, and I'm just going to choose probably a purple color. And with the highlights, oops, we got way too many of these open. I'll very light golden yellow. And I might play around with those colors, but for now, I'm going to change the blend mode to soft light. And I'm going to reduce the opacity. And this is just to get a bit of magenta in the darker parts of our image and to get a bit of yellow in the highlights, a bit more than we had previously. I might make this slightly more red and slightly darker. And I might make this slightly more yellow and slightly darker. And so we're applying a sort of a highlight of, that's a bit, there we go. Applying a highlight of yellow and a shadow of purple with a dramatically reduced opacity and the application of blend mode soft light versus something like multiply or color in this case, or overlay. They also, all of these blend modes have different effects. But soft light to me is like just a very general application that's quite simple. And then to finalize this, I think we'll go into detail. Or no, sorry. Do I want to go into? Yeah, we're going to go into the gradient map. And I'm going to open up a secondary panel of tools, which lives underneath, which is this. So we have the brush tool, the gradient tool, and then the radial gradient tool. And I'm just going to use the gradient tool, and I'm going to spin this gradient around so the effect is applied to the bottom of our image. And we can see that application is going to take place because it gives this red area right here at the bottom. So if I was to pull this top portion up, you could see that our gradient will move and it'll affect more of our image. I'm just going to take this bottom portion here, and I think all I'm going to do is increase the clarity and play around with the contrast slightly. I don't necessarily want to add a vignette to our image, but I do want to get this area, without cropping it, I do want to visually sort of mute it a little bit. So I'm thinking about just slightly reducing the exposure just in this bottom portion here. Yeah, I think we're happy with that. And I'll click done and save to this, and it'll obviously save the changes to our development image here. And the other thing I can do is while I'm in this image, if I go to save as, which was mentioned earlier, if I go to, oops. If I go to save as from the save section here, I can save a JPEG directly from this image. So I can take this image and I can save it as a TIFF or a JPEG or a PNG. Save as in this case is just going to create a new copy. So I will put it in this folder. We'll just call it new edits, TIFF. And then what I can also do is basically what that's going to do is it's going to create a new TIFF from our image if we save as. So this is those adjustments applied to this new TIFF image. But this TIFF in of itself doesn't have any development adjustments, as you'll notice by the lack of the develop icon on the bottom left-hand corner here. So the takeaway from that is when we go to save a new image, it's not going to have any developments. It's just going to be a brand new image based on those edits. Alternatively, too, what we can do is save as a copy. And if we save as a copy, let's go same TIFF. We'll go copy. I'm trying to remember the difference between the two. Save as a copy will maintain your edits and save the new copy of the image, where save as will just save the new image. So in this case, what I would recommend doing is adjusting or saving those adjustments to the image, and then saving as your image, or when you've made your development changes to your image, and you want to save it down. But you don't yet want to move away from your image, then you would save as a copy. And that sort of looks at the development aspect of this image. I could tweak this for days. I still want to make minor edits to this, but I do want to come back to some of these questions. So I'm going to have a look at these. Okay, so let's have a look. Files from scan transparencies don't make raw, usually TIFFs. Any way to create a non-destructible faux raw? No. To create a non-destructible faux raw. Scanned from transparencies. I see. Don't make raw. Usually TIFFs. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Because TIFF is a very, very high quality file. It's still a lossy file to my understanding, but it saves at a much higher file size to create a non-destructible faux raw. So that'll work. Well, in terms of non-destructibility, you can still open up that TIFF file in develop mode and make all of these development changes. So I think the answer to your question is if you have saved a TIFF, which is a very much higher than a JPEG a file quality, you can use develop mode to make those adjustments. I just don't think you're going to get that same XMP profile. Not to my knowledge. I don't think it creates an XMP file for TIFFs, just as they are writable. But yeah, I would just edit that TIFF in develop mode. Graham asked, is there a setting in ACDSee to embed the XMP data in the raw file? That's not possible. No. I have a problem with sharpness in raw as well. Why? And why can't we, what can we do about it? Okay, so let's go into our original image, for example, in develop mode. So we're going to just entertain this idea for develop mode. So if we go into our original image, there's a lot of things you can do in regards to sharpness. If we go to detail and then we can go to the brush, we can adjust sharpness on parts of our image by using the brush tool and increasing the sharpness. So here I am in the detail pad. I'm using the detail brush and I can brush sharpness onto parts of my image. But that being said, this is a very general adjustment, right? You can see the sharpness increase in the center of our image here. If your problem is sharpness in your image because you have a whole parts of your image that are blurry, well, I mean, that's an issue that you want to tackle in edit mode, because it'll enable you to take these two images and line them up in essence using layers, and then use masks to blur out the bottom portion of your section, or rather, let's reframe that, to use masks to hide from view the bottom portion and to show the top in the area, so that you can create a combination of an image that's fully in focus based on what you're talking about. Sharpness, talking about sharpening, what does the mask option do? In sharpness. Oh, like the general adjustments here. So let's take a look here. So increase the amount. So the radius adjusts, I mean, in this case, the central application. Whoa, that's a pretty interesting change. Let's think this through. Okay, let's dramatically reduce the radio and just increase the mask. So if I have a mask of 100, interesting. I think this is functionally working similar to like an opacity slider. That's a weird way of describing it. But if I go all the way to the 100, it looks like the application hasn't been applied. If I go all the way to 0, it looks like the application is applied in full. And if I go in the center, yeah. That's right. So yeah. So if you're interacting with the mask, I think it's the only one where, yeah, if you hit the Alt key while you're interacting with the mask, the Alt key only will apply to the mask. So basically it shows you while I'm interacting with the slider, if I hold down the Alt key, I can show myself essentially what parts of the image I'm masking, which parts of the image that I'm adjusting. Okay, so this mask here, when I hold the Alt key, is showing me how much of my image is going to receive the final, the sharpening adjustments. So when I, in this case, I've dramatically increased the sharpening amount, and I've clicked on mask here, and I hold Alt over top of my image, it shows me what parts of my image are going to be receiving the amount, the radius, the amount of detail, that sort of thing, when I go to adjust those final values. And what I can do is I can actually change that relationship by adjusting the slider, the mask slider. And that's sort of why I said it's being applied in full. What's on the very far left here, it looks like the adjustments are being applied to our whole image. Hence, the mask is now completely white. If we go all the way to the right, it should be the mask is almost completely black. Whereas sort of further along, maybe like 1/4 of the way through our image, a good portion of our image is going to be the subject of this adjustment, right? So if you just want your mask to, so rather, if you just want your adjustments to be applied to your whole image, then you just leave this at 0. If you wanted your if you want those sharpening adjustments to be applied to specific parts of your image, which in this case it looks like it's searching for texture in your image, and then it's going to apply that amount and radius detail, that sort of thing, to your image. Yeah, no problem. Laura asked, hello, David Olson. Oh, okay, that's from before. So David asked, so if I make a development change to a JPEG and give it to someone, I am giving them a record of my changes work. If so, if I export the image, is this a result? Okay, yeah, this is a good question. If you give somebody an image that you've developed in ACDSee, and then you send them that JPEG, you're sending them the finished file. Like you're sending them an image that's been developed in ACDSee, and it'll look like the changes that you're giving them. But that's not the case for a raw file, not unless you supply that XMP profile. Okay. So, but the answer to your question is if you were to make adjustments in develop mode, save them to your file, you can see that little development icon in the bottom left-hand corner. And you were to provide this file to somebody else, they're going to be able to see that file. I believe, provided that you've embedded, or no, I think that actually might just be a visible. Yeah, no, because it's saved right to the file. Yeah, so no, it's written. You're good. And give them a record of my changes work. Right, you could provide them. Oh, I see what you're asking. Sorry, I misunderstood this. Okay, they're not going to be able to see the development adjustments. So if you were to give them that JPEG file, and somebody else was open up in an ACDSee and open up that file, it's not going to contain those adjustments in development. It's not going to show them the sharpening and that sort of thing, the noise reduction at those values. Not to my knowledge. It's possible that that information is written, but I have a strong inkling that's not the case. That's actually a very good question, David, and I think the other thing too is I definitely know that this isn't the case for a raw file, but I want to verify that. So I mean, I would shoot me an email and I'll ask our devs whether or not you can send someone a JPEG file and they can see those development history, but I'm doubtful. But email me and I'll find an answer for you. Either way. Merlin asked, I've explained this earlier, but I've compared several RAW and JPEG files created by Lumix G7. I could not see any difference in aspect. Both as detailed and ACDSee edits them to yield the exactly same results. The only effective difference is file size. So why would I choose RAW? That's a really good question as well. RAW is a much larger file than a JPEG. Maybe the reason why you would choose RAW in this instance versus a JPEG file, or some other form of a file type, is because you wanted to edit directly the RAW file before providing your customer a save as version of the JPEG. So you did it all in one place. Because otherwise what it might require you to do is, okay, I have this raw file, I'm going to make a copy of this raw file, and then I'm going to go forward and edit that JPEG from there. If you're working with the raw file, because everything's non-destructive, you can just edit the one image and then save the copies that you require. There's really no direct answer to that question though, because most of it just comes down to what does your workflow look like. And if you've done the tests and you're saying like, okay, well, these are very comparable in terms of quality to 99% of my clients or customers or whoever, well then yeah, just go forward with your JPEG images. One of the huge factors of the reason why people work in RAW and then they save as a JPEG is because they're not selling to their customers the original RAW file. They're keeping that for themselves. They're selling their customer an edited version of the original. And then as a sort of substitute of that, Norm just added JPEGs are compressed files, RAW are not, which means that JPEGs are lossy, RAW are not lossy files. Yeah, that's a good question though. I do think it comes down to workflow. Carlo, I use ACDSee Photo Studio 6 for Mac, and I was used to use ACDSee on Windows. For some reason, maybe a setting, I can't see the preview pane or the picture in the Manage Desktop tab. That is an email me question, and that definitely sounds like a QA problem / maybe even a support issue. But Carlo, please email me with that. That's a great question. Bill asked, if you edit the JPEG and save, then move it to another folder or allow considerable time to pass, can ACDSee still return to the original form? How does it know the original form? Where is that information stored? Yeah, we talked about this earlier. It's stored in a hidden folder called original. So that original folder contains that, like the knowledge of the original file, and that information isn't going to be viewable to you unless you have that folder shown to you in your Windows section there. It's also not shown. I believe it's not shown. Actually, let's go back to manage mode and have a quick little look. So another thing you can do in ACDSee is you can actually view your XMP files directly from manage mode. So in this case, we have one raw file, right, that has development changes to it. I can go to filter and advanced filters, and I can show it. So I can show my XMP files, and I can also show my hidden files and folders directly from ACDSee. So here's that XMP profile. And then we have our developed and originals folder. I would recommend not, if possible, I'd recommend not showing these, just because you could, in this case, lose, as Bill's saying, you could lose your original by deleting your original folder. And the developed folder isn't as important. It just contains a save of your thumbnails. As for the XMP profile, the most you could lose is your development settings. You would never lose the original. But you can go to filter and advanced filters to show your XMP files or show your hidden files and folders within ACDSee. No. Randy asked, raw files cannot be edited even in edit mode. As mentioned earlier, raw files are proprietary to the make and model of your camera. So, and the reason why something like ACDSee or Photoshop can't edit those files is because that proprietary information is held by Canon or Nikon or whoever makes your camera. So no, that's the reason why you can't directly edit a raw file. Not in edit mode. I mean, you can edit a raw file. You're just going to be saving it as a JPEG in edit mode. You can edit a raw file in develop mode. It's just you're saving your adjustments to an XMP profile. You're never saving over the original raw file. Jamie asked, back to saving the JPEG. Can you choose the quality file size? I poked around to find something, but no joy. So when I'm going to save as is, I don't know that offhand. That would be a question you would ask me in email, and I can find out with our dev team whether or not that's possible. I want to say it is, but I'm not quite sure. So please email me. Oh, speaking of which, I forgot to link my email. I haven't linked it for a while. So I will add that to chat right now. Jillian asked, the original folder was created when you edited the JPEG and looked to have a copy. Yeah, we talked about this. Actually, an original. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Cheryl said you can change in batch, but I'm not sure if you can batch while you're in develop mode. I think that's a question. Adam, in the view mode, I see above the film strip the option to raw decode. What's the purpose of that? In the view mode, I see the film strip option to raw decode. Filtering criteria. Above the film strip. Where is that icon that you're seeing? I'm not certain. I can find out, but I don't know. Terry asked, how are you making a copy of the original raw file? You can make a copy of the original raw file by copying and pasting the raw file. You can do so in manage mode. You can't make a copy of the original raw file while you're in develop mode, I don't think. Let me just verify this, because I think when you go to save as or save, the only options are going to be writable files. Just want to verify this. Export JPEG. Yeah, the only way that you're going to be able to interact with that original raw file is by creating a copy of it in manage mode with you're copying it. Beecher asked, what is the advantage of shooting raw files? Maintaining the main advantage is the file size contains way more information, like in terms of pixels, and it contains like a ton more light information. So when you're interacting with the raw file, you're shooting like basically the best quality file you can, and you're editing from that. So the degree of loss is very minimal when you're interacting with the raw file. When you're going to save that file down, basically you're working with the best quality file you possibly can. Contains the most visual information. Thank you, Simon. Take care. Chris asked if I want to email you. What's your email? Just provided a second ago, but it's aprice@acdsystems.com. Witold, yeah, we got that. Dave, so we're going to crop a raw file so that the new raw file does not contain certain items that one may not want to be retained in a raw image. No, I don't believe so. Again, there's no adjustments that can be made, crop or otherwise, to a raw file in of itself. Pardon me, when you make those adjustments in ACDSee, it's going to prompt to create that XMP profile, or you're saving as a different non-destructive file. So Adam, would you take a JPEG photo rather than a RAW? I would set up my camera to take both, actually. Most cameras do. You can set them to take a RAW file and a JPEG. Again, I'm more of a graphic designer. I don't do as much photography, but I would definitely shoot RAW. 100%. Especially if I'm going to be selling those images, and if it's more as I'm a hobbyist, a photo taker, I'm taking photos mostly for myself. In which case, I might not need that raw file. But as soon as I'm taking photos for weddings or taking headshots and stuff like that, I'm absolutely taking a raw file, 100%, every single time. Thank you, Suzanne. Take care. Wayne asked. I sent an email if you don't have a quick answer on this. When I view my Fuji raw file in ACDSee, it looks as shot. Okay. However, when I change to develop mode, the entire image goes much darker and the histogram shifts to left. Have you heard of this problem? I haven't. Wayne, if I haven't emailed you already, I will soon. But that I definitely, if you haven't, please email me, because that's not a problem that I can resolve in this workshop. I haven't heard of it either. No. Thank you, Christopher. Take care. Robert asked, if I wanted to make a backup of the developed pics, is saving the originals with the XMPs is sufficient, or is there an additional database to be saved? No, there's no, no. To be sufficient in this mode, I would use ACDSee to navigate to the new location on your hard drive and save those images there. Either copy and paste them or save them another way. The metadata is what is actually saved within the database. And the metadata is like categories, keywords, labels, ratings, thumbnails, that sort of thing. The interactions that you're making in develop mode are not going to pertain to that catalog in the same way. Yeah, so no, I would do as we've talked about, Robert, and you'll be just fine. There's no other database information that is based on the visual quality of those developments. Thank you, Rick. Barbie asked, can ACDSee work with drone pictures and videos? I think so. I'm not sure what file type those are. That's worth checking on our website. We have a section on our website dedicated to illustrating what file formats ACDSee can work in. There might be some drones that take universal pictures and videos, in which case that's probably fine. Like, for example, if it took an MP4 or shot a JPEG or a TIFF, that'll be fine. But there might be some drones that shoot in a proprietary file format that we might not yet support. The other thing too is, I bet you drones, much like most cameras, will save in both. So if you were to use your drone, just set it up in the settings so that it takes, if it does have a proprietary file type, it saves that in addition to a writable file. Andre asked, is there a keyboard shortcut to alter brush size? The keyboard shortcut is the mouse wheel. I don't think there's a keyboard shortcut now that I think about it. But the mouse wheel is what I use to scroll in and out of the brush size. Jamie asked, can you talk about using the brush to make targeted changes to the sky? Yeah, sure. We can talk about that briefly. I'm realizing this workshop has gone very long, but I will just briefly touch on this in the tune pane. So I have my image here. I'm in tune. I'm taking out the brush tool. And what the brush can do is it can adjust these values right here underneath the brush: exposure, saturation, vibrance, temperature, tint, fill light, contrast, clarity, etc. So what I can do is I can use my brush and I can select a portion of the sky here in my image, and I have smart brushing turned off. So I'm just using my selection here. And I will unhide show brush strokes to illustrate an exposure adjustment. So when I increase the exposure adjustment, I'm increasing the light in the sky here. If I lower it, I'm darkening the sky. If I use the saturation adjustment, I'm desaturating or saturating the sky. If I change the temperature, I'm making the sky more yellow. So that's without smart brushing. I'll just reset these values, and this time I'm going to turn smart brushing on. Smart brushing is a method to select parts of your image. So when I'm using the smart brushing, I should be, with a low tolerance, be able to select a portion of my sky and maybe not the clouds, as you can see here. So smart brushing is a way to search for specific pixels when you're using the nib tool. So I'm just going to go through and I'm just going to select that sky range here. And what I can do is, now that I have that sky selected, I can say change, I don't know, let's change the vibrance, say. And I'll turn off the smart brushing, and that's just affecting that one area. So the brush tool is a great way to selectively edit parts of your image, and you can do so by using just a general brush by turning the smart brushing off, or you can select color, brightness, or a mixture of color and brightness by using magic and adjusting the tolerance as you see fit. So Jamie, that is how you use the brush tool, and this just relates to these general settings within Toon. There is a separate brush for the detail panel, I believe. There is a tutorial on blend modes, Jillian. If you go to our YouTube and our workshop section, it's there. I will actually show you that because it's worth knowing. I'll just go to our YouTube panel here, go to playlists, and I'll go to our workshop playlists. And we did one long ago, blending, right in our workshop section right there. And just a reminder that our YouTube channel is youtube.com/ACDSee Photo Studio. Let's answer some of these. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, James. Hi, Adam. Got a little. Okay, great. Louise says, thanks for this wonderful talk. As always, very nice. Thank you, from Brazil. The darkening of raw, Hans says, the darkening of a raw when opening in development, it goes back to the unedited original image. Darkening of a raw when opening in the develop, it goes back to the unedited original image, the lighter version when the camera has made changes for the JPEG. Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, James. Greg asks, I have both ACDSee Ultimate 2020 and ACDSee 19. When I view some JPEG files with 19, the colors look the same as with the other JPEG editors, so I'm calling 19 correct. But when I view them with Ultimate 2020, the colors are significantly different and therefore not correct. This is a real limitation for me. What can be done? Contact me, Greg. Please send me an email. I'm not certain I know what you're experiencing, but I can get to the bottom of it. So that would be what I would do. I would like to help you, and I think this is more of a support question than it is a Adam Price question, but I can definitely help you. Hi, Ivor. Many thanks for section. Yeah, thank you. Take care. Thank you, JP. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Paul. Greg asked, back to the question regarding specifying the JPEG file size when saving. It appears that can be controlled during the export function. Yeah, well, you can, let's try this because we did, or no, we're already in develop mode. Yeah, let's take a look. So, oh yeah, you do have an output size section here. I don't really use this. I would just batch the image. But there does appear to be some information that you can apply here. In this case, the resolution of 240p, and you can adjust the dimensions, that sort of thing, as you export, which would make sense. This basically works the same way that our batching process does. That's just the tools in this case might be a bit more limited. But so yeah, it looks like sorry, was that who asked that question? Greg. Yeah, that appears to be exactly the case that you can export via and change the file size and a variety of other different functions. Looks like you might be able to change the file format, that sort of thing in there as well, Greg. Sorry, I didn't catch that when we were talking. So somebody asked, John, can you explain the difference between a sidecar file and XMP file? They're the same thing. ACDSee creates an XMP file, which is a type of sidecar file. All a sidecar file is a file that lives next door to your file that provides information to it. So sidecar file is like the term for all of the file types that are created by photo editors, like a program like ACDSee, and the XMP file is what ACDSee creates. So if you refer to them as sidecar files, that's great. That's what an XMP is. And in this case, the XMP file is just what ACDSee creates. So Carlo, thank you so much. Yes, this will be on our workshop YouTube page in 2 days, as always. I will supply that. So it'll be uploaded and it will be on our YouTube page in a couple days. So thank you so much, Barbie. Thank you, Martin. Okay, I've talked for a really long time. The last thing I'll say is if you've enjoyed this workshop and you don't have the most current version of ACDSee or whatever, I just like to remind you that because you participate in the workshop today, the coupon code is available to you. This applies to Ultimate, Pro, Mac, and Home. It's 15% off at checkout. The coupon itself is Adam P, all capitals, and then 15. So Adam P 15. There you are. And just as a note, that applies. So when you're in the English site on acdc.com, if you want to be on the German site or the French site or something like that, this coupon won't work, but if you email me, I can find you something. So let me know. That's it. My throat is dry. I've talked as much as I could. If you have any questions, there's tons of stuff that I wasn't able to answer. Please email me. I'll get back to you within the next couple days. So as always, and I hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday, whatever time it is where you live, and take care.